Ambassador Kethver walked into the briefing room with his usual confident stride. The crystal walls of the Galactic Council building reflected his tall blue form as he moved toward the central table. 3 other council members waited for him. There, each representing different species from across the galaxy. The morning light from Zentara Prime's twin suns made the room glow with a soft purple hue. Ambassador Kethver, said Council Member Vextara, her forearms gesturing toward an empty chair. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Kethver settled into his seat and activated his recording device. As a diplomatic observer for the Zorvian Collective, he had witnessed dozens of conflicts across the galaxy. Most were simple territorial disputes that ended within days. Some species fought over resources, others over ideology, but all followed predictable patterns. War was just another form of negotiation, usually ending when losses exceeded acceptable limits. We have an assignment. For you, Vextara continued. The humans are currently engaged in what they call a defensive war against hegemony raiders in the Tau Ceti system. Kethver's 3 eyes blinked in sequence. He had heard of humans before, but only in passing. They were a relatively new species, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years ago. Their homeworld was located in an unremarkable system on the galaxy's outer rim. Most council members considered them primitive and barely worth attention. The humans have been fighting for 3 months now, added Council Member Zatok, his scaled head tilting slightly. Intelligence reports suggest they are severely outnumbered by. How much? Kethver asked, already pulling up tactical data on his portable display. 12 to 1, Vextara replied. The hegemony has committed a full battle fleet. The humans have only a small defensive force protecting 3 colony worlds. Kethver nodded slowly. The hegemony were known raiders who targeted weak systems for resources and slaves. They were brutal but efficient, rarely wasting time on prolonged conflicts. Against those odds, any reasonable species would either surrender or evacuate their civilians. The fact that humans were still fighting after 3 months suggested either stupidity or desperation. What exactly do you want me to observe? He asked. We want a detailed report on human military capabilities, said the 3rd council member, a floating gas being named Flexara. Several species have requested that humans be considered for membership in the Galactic Defense Coalition. Before we make any decisions, we need to understand how they conduct warfare. Kethver almost laughed. The Defense Coalition was reserved for species with proven military excellence. The Zorvians had earned their place through calculated strategic victories. The Veltari had demonstrated superior technology and logistics. The idea that a primitive species like humanity could qualify seemed absurd. I understand there have been some unusual reports. Vextara added carefully, some of our intelligence sources have filed contradictory information about human tactical doctrines. Contradictory how? Kethver asks, some reports suggest humans employ conventional defensive strategies. Others describe tactics that seem highly unconventional, even reckless, Zatok explained. We need someone with your experience to determine which reports are accurate. Kethver leaned back in his chair. Throughout his career, he had observed 17 different species during wartime. Each had their own cultural approaches to conflict, but all followed basic logical principles. Overwhelming force was met with strategic withdrawal. Superior numbers required defensive positions. Limited resources demanded careful conservation. These were universal laws of warfare, as predictable as physics. When do I leave? He asked. Immediately. Flexara replied. We have arranged transport aboard a neutral observation vessel. You will rendezvous with the human command ship and remain. As a diplomatic observer for the duration of the conflict, how long is that expected to be? Kethver asked. Given the odds, probably not long, Vextara said quietly. The humans have lost 60% of their fleet already. Standard projections suggest complete defeat within 2 weeks. Kethver gathered his materials and stood. 2 weeks would be more than enough time to document another predictable military collapse. He would file his report recommending against human inclusion in galactic affairs. then returned to more important diplomatic matters. The council members seemed to think humans might possess some special military capability, but Kethver knew better. He had seen enough wars to recognize the patterns. "I assume you want a complete tactical analysis?" he asked. "Yes, but also focus on their decision-making processes," Vextara replied. "Some reports suggest humans make choices that other species find difficult to understand. Every species thinks their enemies are irrational," Kethver said with a slight smile. "Usually they are just following different priorities." As he walked toward the exit, Kethver felt confident about the assignment. Humans were probably fighting harder than expected because they had nowhere to retreat. Once their losses reached critical levels, they would either surrender or be destroyed. Either outcome would provide clear evidence that they were not ready for galactic military responsibilities. The transport ship waited in orbit, its sleek design reflecting the advanced technology of the neutral observer cores. Kethver settled into his quarters and began reviewing the preliminary files on human civilization. They seemed unremarkable in every way. Average technology, standard social structures, typical resource distribution. Nothing suggested any special military capabilities within hours. They were traveling through hyperspace toward the Tau Ceti system. Kethver spent the journey preparing his observation protocols and reviewing tactical analysis procedures. He expected to witness a standard defensive action followed by inevitable defeat. The humans would probably fight bravely for a primitive species, but bravery alone never won wars against superior numbers. As the ship dropped out of hyperspace, Kethver looked out at the Tau Ceti system through the observation windows. 3 planets hung in the darkness, each surrounded by orbital defense platforms. In the distance, he could see the scattered lights of spacecraft engaged in what appeared to be ongoing combat. The human defensive fleet looked pathetically small compared to the hegemony forces surrounding them still fighting. The ship's captain noted with surprise. "Intelligence said they should have been defeated by now." Kethver nodded absently. "Desperate species sometimes fought longer than logical analysis predicted. The humans were probably just taking longer to accept reality." Within days, he would be documenting their final collapse and filing his report. The shuttle approached the human command vessel through a field of debris and damaged ships. Kethver watched through the small window as pieces of destroyed spacecraft drifted past like metallic snow. Some fragments were clearly from hegemony vessels, their black hull plating twisted and melted. Others belonged to human ships, recognizable by their simpler construction and bright paint markings. "Welcome to the Liberty's Edge," came a voice through the communication system. The accent was strange to Kethver's ears. With sharp consonants and rolling vowels unlike any galactic standard, he knew the human ship looked different from other vessels Kethver had observed. Where most species built sleek, efficient designs, this ship appeared functional but crude. Thick armor plating covered the hull in overlapping sections. Weapon systems jutted out at odd angles. Several areas showed obvious battle damage that had been quickly repaired with mismatched materials. The shuttle docked with a mechanical clang that vibrated through the floor. Kethver gathered his diplomatic materials and followed the pilot toward the airlock. As the doors opened, he stepped into what appeared to be organized chaos. Human crew members moved through the corridors with quick, efficient steps. They wore simple uniforms in various shades of blue and gray. Most carried data tablets or toolkits, talking rapidly in their strange language as they hurried past. The ship's interior was cramped by galactic standards, with low ceilings and narrow passages. That forced Kethver to duck his head. "Ambassador Kethver?" A human approached from a side corridor. He was shorter than Kethver expected, with dark hair and pale skin marked by several small scars. "I'm Captain Jake Morrison." "Welcome aboard." Kethver activated his translation device and offered the standard diplomatic greeting. The human responded with a quick smile and what appeared to be a gesture of respect, though it looked more casual than formal. "I understand you're here to observe our operations," Captain Morrison continued as they walked through the ship. "I have to warn you, we're in the middle of active combat preparations." Things might get a bit hectic. They passed through several compartments filled with humans working on various tasks. Some repaired equipment while others studied tactical displays. All moved with a sense of urgency that Kethver found unusual. Most species he had observed took time for proper planning and consultation before major decisions. "How long have you been fighting the hegemony?" Kethver asked as they entered what appeared to be the command center. 87 days, replied a female human seated at a complex console. She turned toward them with tired eyes and extended her hand in the same gesture Captain Morrison had used. "I'm Strategic Officer Lisa Grant," Kethver calculated quickly. 87 days was far longer than any species should be able to maintain defensive operations against such overwhelming odds. Either the humans possessed some technology he was unaware of, or they were simply prolonging an inevitable defeat. "The council briefing suggested you were severely outnumbered," he said carefully. 12-1 at last count," Captain Morrison replied with what sounded almost like amusement. "Might be worse now. We lost another destroyer yesterday." Lisa Grant pulled up a tactical display that showed the current situation. Red markers represented hegemony forces surrounding 3 blue planets. Green markers indicated human ships, but they were scattered and clearly outnumbered. Several areas showed recent battle sites marked with yellow warning symbols. "We've been fighting a mobile defense," Lisa Grant explained. "Hit-and-run tactics, mostly. The hegemony wants to establish orbital control over our colonies, but we keep disrupting their formations." Kethver studied the display with growing confusion. The human positions made no strategic sense. They had divided their already small fleet into even smaller groups, spreading them across the entire system. Any competent military commander would concentrate forces to maximize defensive effectiveness. "Your fleet deployment seems unusually dispersed," he observed diplomatically. "Yeah. Most species don't fight like we do," Captain Morrison agreed. "We learned a long time ago that conventional tactics don't work when you're outnumbered this badly." "So you developed unconventional approaches?" Kethver asked. "We developed human approaches," Lisa Grant said with a slight grin. "Turns out there's a difference." Before Kethver could ask what she meant, an alarm sounded throughout the ship. Red lights flashed in the corridors as human crew members began moving even faster. Captain Morrison stepped to a communication panel and spoke rapidly into it. "All stations, this is Morrison. Hegemony Task Force moving toward Colony 3. All available units converge on Grid 77 Alpha. Operation Broken Arrow is now active." Kethver felt a chill run through his diplomatic training. He had heard that name during the council briefing, but no one had explained what it meant. The way the humans spoke about it suggested something significant. "Operation Broken Arrow?" he asked. Captain Morrison and Lisa Grant exchanged a look that seemed to communicate something without words. It was the kind of expression Kethver had learned to recognize during his diplomatic career, the look of people about to do something desperate. "We've been planning this for 3 weeks," Captain Morrison explained. "The hegemony is getting ready for their final assault on our colonies. They're bringing everything they have, concentrating their entire fleet for one massive attack." "A logical strategy," Kethver agreed. "Overwhelming force applied at a single point." "Right," Lisa Grant said. "So while they're doing that, we're going to hit their supply lines, their command ships, and their staging areas all at the same time." Kethver processed this information. Slowly, the humans were planning to attack while defending. They intended to divide their forces even further and engage a superior enemy on multiple fronts simultaneously. By every strategic principle he understood, it was tactical suicide. "You're planning an offensive operation while under siege?" he asked. "Best time to attack is when the enemy thinks you can't," Captain Morrison replied. "They've been fighting us for 3 months, expecting us to act like every other species they've encountered. Defensive positions, conservation of resources, logical retreat when losses become unacceptable. Those are sound military principles." Kethver pointed out. "For most species," Lisa Grant agreed. "But humans didn't evolve fighting other species. We evolved fighting each other. We learned war from the most vicious, creative, and stubborn opponents in the galaxy, ourselves, The ship shuddered slightly as its engines increased power. Through the command center's windows, Kethver could see other human vessels moving into formation. They looked small and fragile compared to the hegemony ships visible in the distance. "How many casualties do you expect?" He asked. "All of them, probably," Captain Morrison said casually. "But that's not really the point." Kethver stared at the human commander. In all his years of diplomatic observation, he had never heard a military leader discuss total casualties as an acceptable outcome. Most species fought to minimize losses while achieving objectives. Humans seem to be planning for maximum sacrifice while hoping for impossible victory. "I don't understand." He admitted. "You will," Lisa Grant said quietly. "Just watch what happens next." As the Liberty's Edge accelerated toward the battle zone, Kethver realized he was about to observe something unprecedented in his experience. The humans were not just fighting a hopeless battle, they were embracing it with enthusiasm that bordered on madness. The tactical display showed human ships converging from across the system, each small formation moving toward targets that logic said they could not possibly defeat. Kethver began recording everything, suspecting that whatever happened next would be unlike anything in galactic military history. The battle began at 0347 ship time, though Kethver quickly realized that humans did not fight battles in any conventional sense. What unfolded before him was something between warfare and controlled insanity. From the observation deck of the Liberty's Edge, Kethver watched as Commander Ryan Torres led the first wave of the attack. His squadron consisted of 12 ships, most showing significant battle damage from previous engagements. According to every tactical manual Kethver had studied, damaged ships should be withdrawn for repairs or relegated to support roles instead. Torres used his most damaged vessel as the spearhead of his attack. "Torres, to all units," came the voice over the communication system. "Remember, we're not trying to win a fair fight here. Fair fights are for species that have time to waste." Kethver watched in fascination as Torres's ship, bleeding atmosphere from multiple hull breaches, accelerated directly toward a hegemony battle cruiser that outmassed it by at least 10-1. The ship's engines were clearly damaged, producing an uneven thrust that should have made precise maneuvering impossible. "Torres, your ship is falling apart," came another voice from the squadron. "That's the plan," Torres replied with what sounded like laughter. Hegemony computers are programmed to calculate threat levels based on ship condition. "They're going to ignore us until we're right on top of them." The damaged human ship continued its erratic approach while the hegemony cruiser focused its weapons on larger, apparently healthier targets. Just as Kethver expected the humans to veer away or launch weapons at maximum range, something unprecedented happened. Torres rammed his ship directly into the enemy cruiser's engine section at full velocity. The explosion was visible across the entire battle zone, a brilliant flash that temporarily overwhelmed the observation deck's visual filters. When the display cleared, both ships were gone, replaced by expanding clouds of debris and superheated gas. "Torres squadron, this is Liberty Actual," came Captain Morrison's voice. "Confirm impact." "Confirmed," replied another squadron member. Ryan took out their main propulsion. "Cruiser is dead in space." Kethver stared at the debris field where two ships had just destroyed each other. The human commander had deliberately sacrificed his vessel and crew to disable a single enemy ship. It was tactically effective but strategically incomprehensible. "Did Commander Torres survive?" he asked Lisa Grant. "No," she replied without emotion. "That was a kinetic kill. No survivors on either side, and this is considered acceptable?" Kethver pressed. "Ryan volunteered for the mission," Captain Morrison explained from his command position. "We needed that cruiser eliminated, and ramming was the most reliable method." Before Kethver could respond, the tactical display erupted with new activity. Lieutenant Amy Watson's fighter wing was approaching an asteroid field where hegemony ships had taken defensive positions. The asteroids provided excellent cover and made conventional attack runs nearly impossible. "Watson wing, you are cleared for Thunder Run," came the order from Liberty's Edge. "Copy that," Lieutenant Watson replied. "All fighters, follow my lead and try not to think about what we're doing." Kethver watched as 12 small human fighters dove into the asteroid field at speeds that violated every safety protocol he knew. The fighters weaved between massive rocks, their pilots performing maneuvers that should have been impossible for biological beings to survive. "What is a thunder run?" Kethver asked. "High-speed pursuit through hazardous terrain," Lisa Grant explained. "Most species avoid flying through asteroid fields because the risk of collision is too high. Then why are they doing it?" "Because hegemony pilots avoid it too," Captain Morrison said with a grin. "They're using computer-guided navigation systems that prioritize safety. Our pilots are using intuition and reflexes on the display." Kethver watched human fighters threading through gaps between asteroids that seemed impossibly narrow. Several times he was certain a collision was inevitable, only to see the small ships somehow adjust their course at the last possible moment. The hegemony ships, trapped in defensive positions, tried to track the incoming fighters with their weapons. But the asteroids that provided cover also blocked their targeting systems. By the time the human fighters emerged from the field, they were already launching weapons at point-blank range. "How do your pilots survive those acceleration forces?" Kethver asked as he watched one fighter pull what his instruments registered. "As a 12-gravity turn, they don't always," Lisa Grant replied matter-of-factly. "Amy lost 2 pilots to G-force injuries last week. But the ones who survive get better at it." The battle continued to escalate beyond anything Kethver had experienced. Chief Engineer Pete Collins appeared on the command deck, his uniform stained with lubricants and his hands covered in minor burns. "Captain, I've got good news and bad news," he announced. "Bad news first," Morrison replied. "Main power coupling is fried. We're running on emergency backup, and that won't last more than 6 hours. And the good news? I've figured out how to reroute power through the cargo bay lighting system. We can keep weapons online, but everything else is going to be pretty dim." Kethver listened to this exchange with growing amazement. The humans were treating critical system failures as minor inconveniences. Any reasonable crew would withdraw for repairs. Instead, they were improvising solutions that violated basic engineering principles. "Is it safe to reroute that much power through lighting circuits?" he asked. "Probably not," Pete Collins admitted cheerfully. "But it'll work long enough to finish the fight. What if it fails?" "Then we'll figure out something else," Captain Morrison said. "Pete's gotten us this far by breaking rules that other species think are important, as if to demonstrate this point." An alarm sounded indicating hull breaches on 3 decks. Instead of panic, the announcement was met with casual acknowledgement and immediate action. Damage control teams moved toward the breaches while other crew members continued their tasks as if nothing unusual had happened. "Hull breach on Deck 7, came a voice over the communication system. "Nothing critical hit. We'll have it patched in 20 minutes. "Hull breach on Deck 12, came another report. "Lost 2 storage compartments, but we weren't using them anyway. "Hull breach on Deck 15, came a third voice. "This one's a bit bigger, but it's got a nice view of the battle if anyone wants to watch." Kethver realized that the human crew was treating combat damage like routine maintenance issues. They showed no signs of stress or fear, only professional interest in solving immediate problems. "Do your people understand they could be killed?" he asked Lisa Grant. "Of course," she replied, "but worrying about it won't change anything. Either we win this fight or we don't. Panicking just makes failure." More likely on the tactical display, more human ships were engaging in behaviors that defied military logic. One destroyer was using its own hull as a shield to protect smaller vessels. A cruiser had detached its engine section and was using it as an unmanned missile. Fighters were flying in formations so tight that collision seemed inevitable. Your tactics appeared designed to maximize casualties. Kethver observed. "Our tactics are designed to maximize effectiveness," Captain Morrison corrected. "Casualties are just the price we pay for victory, but some of these maneuvers are clearly suicidal." "Only if you assume survival is the primary objective," Lisa Grant said. "For humans, completing the mission comes first. Everything else is secondary." As the battle reached its peak intensity, Kethver found himself documenting behaviors that challenged everything he thought he understood about warfare. The humans fought with a combination of tactical creativity and personal sacrifice that seemed to operate outside normal strategic principles. They were not just fighting to survive or defend their territory. They were fighting to demonstrate that numerical superiority and conventional tactics meant nothing against an enemy willing to rewrite the rules of engagement. The battle had been raging for 8 hours when everything changed. Kethver thought he understood human warfare, but what happened next pushed his comprehension beyond all limits. Multiple boarding pods incoming, announced the sensor operator. Hegemony Marines are attempting to take the ship. Kethver felt his 3 hearts skip several beats. Boarding actions were considered the most dangerous form of combat in galactic warfare. Most species avoided them entirely, preferring to destroy enemy vessels from a safe distance. The thought of enemy soldiers fighting inside the ship terrified him. All Marines to repel boarders. Came the announcement over the ship's communication system. Standard room-to-room protocols are now in effect. Captain Morrison noticed Kethver's obvious distress and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry, Ambassador. Our Marines know what they're doing through the ship's internal monitors." Kethver watched as human Marines led by Sergeant Don Kelly moved toward the boarding zones. They wore armor that looked functional but crude compared to galactic standards. Their weapons were simple projectile launchers that fired metal slugs instead of energy beams. "Why do you use such primitive weapons?" Kethver asked. "Because they work," Lisa Grant replied. "Energy weapons are more sophisticated, but bullets don't need power cells or sophisticated targeting systems. They just need someone to point them in the right direction." The first contact came on Deck 9, where Hegemony soldiers had cut through the hull with plasma torches. Kethver watched the monitor as armored figures moved through the breach into the ship's corridors. He expected the human Marines to establish defensive positions and wait for the enemy to advance instead. Sergeant Kelly led a direct assault into the breach zone. "Kelly, to all units," came his voice over the communication system. "Remember, these corridors were designed by humans for humans. Use that advantage." Kethver watched in fascination as the human Marines used their knowledge of the ship's layout to set up ambush in locations that seemed random. They crawled through maintenance shafts, hid in storage compartments, and used service passages that were too small for the larger Hegemony soldiers. "The enemy has superior armor and weapons," he observed, "but they don't know where the light switches are," Sergeant Kelly replied with grim humor as if to demonstrate this point. The corridor lights suddenly went out, plunging the boarding zone into complete darkness. The Hegemony soldiers activated emergency illumination devices while the human Marines seemed to move effortlessly through the blackness. "Night vision equipment?" Kethver asked. "No," Captain Morrison replied. "They grew up on this ship. They know every corridor, every junction, every hiding place. The Hegemony soldiers are fighting in unfamiliar territory. The battle moved through the ship like a deadly game of hide-and-seek." Kethver watched as Private Kate Rogers positioned herself in what appeared to be a supply closet. When Hegemony soldiers passed by her position, she emerged behind them and opened fire at point-blank range. "Impressive tactical positioning." Kethver commented. "That's not tactics," Lisa Grant said quietly. "Kate is wounded. She can barely walk. She's using herself as bait." Before Kethver could ask what she meant, he saw the truth on the monitor. Private Rogers was bleeding heavily from a wound in her leg. She could have retreated to the medical bay, but instead she had positioned herself where she could do the most damage to the enemy. Should she not seek medical attention? He asked. "Mission comes first," Captain Morrison explained. "Kate knows that stopping the boarders is more important than treating her injuries." The fighting intensified as more Hegemony soldiers entered the ship. Kethver watched human Marines use tactics that seemed designed to maximize their own casualties. They fought in pairs, with one Marine drawing enemy fire while the other flanked around for killing shots. "Marine Johnson is down," came a report over the communication system. "Copy that," Sergeant Kelly replied. "Phillips, use Johnson's position as cover. Kethver looked at the monitor and realized that the fallen Marine was still alive but severely injured. The other Marines were using his body as a defensive position while he provided covering fire. "Despite his wounds, your wounded continue to fight?" he asked in amazement. "Until they physically can't," Lisa Grant confirmed. "Marines are trained to consider themselves equipment first and people second." "That seems unnecessarily harsh. It keeps them alive longer," Captain Morrison said. "A Marine who thinks about survival instead of mission effectiveness usually doesn't survive." The boarding action reached its climax when hegemony soldiers broke through to the ship's main reactor compartment. If they could sabotage the reactor, the Liberty's Edge would be disabled or destroyed. "They've reached engineering," came the urgent report. "Reactor containment is at risk." Kethver watched as Private Kate Rogers dragged herself through the corridors toward the reactor compartment. She was leaving a trail of blood behind her, clearly dying from her injuries. But she continued moving with determination that bordered on madness. "Medical team to Deck 15. Came an announcement. Negative," Private Rogers replied over her communication device. "Save the medical supplies for someone who's going to survive this." She reached the reactor compartment just as hegemony soldiers were setting explosive charges on the containment unit. Without hesitation, she activated every grenade she carried and held them against her chest. "Tell my family I completed the mission," she said calmly into her communication device. The explosion destroyed the reactor compartment along with Private Rogers and 6 hegemony soldiers. Emergency systems immediately sealed the area and rerouted power through backup systems. "Reactor compartment lost," came the damage report, but containment held. "No radiation leakage." Kethver stared at the monitor, showing the destroyed compartment. A human soldier had just deliberately killed herself to prevent enemy sabotage. She had treated her own life as an acceptable loss to protect the ship. Private Rogers was barely 20 years old, Lisa Grant said quietly. "She joined the Marines 6 months ago, and she chose to die rather than retreat?" Kethver asked. "She chose to complete her mission," Captain Morrison corrected. "The dying part was just a consequence. The boarding action ended with the elimination of all hegemony soldiers, but at a cost that horrified Kethver. 12 human Marines were dead. 15 more were seriously wounded, and major sections of the ship were damaged beyond repair." Casualty report? Captain Morrison asked. "Acceptable losses," Sergeant Kelly replied. "Mission accomplished." Kethver looked around the command center and realized that the humans were already planning their next operation. They showed no signs of grief or trauma from the boarding action. They treated the death of their comrades as routine operational data. "Do you not mourn your dead?" he asked. "We'll mourn them after we win," Lisa Grant said. "Right now we have work to do." As medical teams moved through the ship treating the wounded, Kethver began to understand something that chilled him to his core. The humans were not just willing to die for victory, they expected it. They had built their entire military philosophy around the assumption that survival was less important than mission completion. "How do you maintain morale with such high casualties?" he asked. "Easy," Captain Morrison replied. "We don't fight to survive. We fight to ensure our enemies never threaten anyone again." For the first time since arriving in the system, Kethver began to question whether he wanted to continue observing human warfare. What he was witnessing was beyond his understanding of civilized conflict. The final phase of Operation Broken Arrow began 18 hours after the boarding action ended. Kethver had not slept, partly because his species required less rest than humans, but mostly because he could not stop watching the tactical displays against every mathematical probability. "The humans were winning. Hegemony command ship is breaking formation," reported the sensor operator. "They're trying to withdraw from the system." Captain Morrison studied the display with calm satisfaction. The massive hegemony fleet that had seemed invincible just days before was now scattered across the system. Half their ships were destroyed or disabled. The remainder were attempting to retreat in disorder. "All units, this is Morrison," he announced over the communication system. "Hegemony forces are in full retreat. Execute pursuit protocols." Kethver watched as the remaining human ships began chasing the fleeing enemy vessels. By any reasonable standard, the humans should have been content with driving off the invasion. They had accomplished the impossible by surviving and protecting their colonies instead. They were pursuing the retreating enemy with the clear intention of destroying every ship. Is pursuit necessary? Kethver asked. The threat to your colonies has been eliminated. The threat to our colonies has been eliminated. Colonel Mike Harrison agreed from his position at the tactical station. But the threat to other systems remains. Other systems? The hegemony will just move on to easier targets. If we let them escape, Lisa Grant explained. Someone with fewer defenses and less experience fighting them, Kethver processed this information slowly. The humans were not just defending their own territory, they were attempting to eliminate the hegemony as a threat to anyone. It was a level of strategic thinking that went beyond simple survival. You're fighting for species you've never met. He asked. We're fighting to make sure this never happens again, Captain Morrison replied. The hegemony attacked our colonies because they thought we were weak. We need to demonstrate that attacking humans is a mistake no one makes twice. The pursuit continued for 6 more hours. Human ships chased fleeing hegemony vessels across the system, picking them off one by one with methodical precision. It was not the wild tactical creativity Kethver had observed earlier, but cold, efficient elimination of defeated enemies. Hegemony destroyer attempting to surrender. Came a report from one of the pursuit squadrons. Copy that, Colonel Harrison replied. Take them alive if possible. Intelligence wants to question survivors. Actually, came a different voice. They just opened fire on our rescue ships. I guess they changed their minds about surrendering. Then make them stop changing their minds, Harrison ordered Kethver. Watched as the human ships eliminated the last enemy vessel with what appeared to be casual efficiency. In less than 24 hours, a fleet that had outnumbered them 12-1 had been completely destroyed. Final casualty report. Captain Morrison asked Medic Nancy Price appeared on the command deck with a data tablet. Her uniform was stained with blood and medical supplies, but her expression was as calm as if she were reporting inventory numbers. We lost 43 ships out of 72, she announced. Personnel casualties are at 68%. Fatal casualties are at 31%. Kethver felt his translation device struggling with the numbers. The humans had lost more than half their fleet and nearly 70% of their personnel. In any military, he knew, such losses would be considered a catastrophic defeat regardless of the tactical outcome. Acceptable? Captain Morrison asked. Within predicted parameters, Colonel Harrison confirmed. We estimated 70% casualties for complete victory. We came out ahead. Outstanding, Morrison said with satisfaction. Begin recovery operations. As Kethver listened to this exchange, he realized that the humans had planned for these catastrophic losses from the beginning. They had calculated that destroying the hegemony fleet was worth the sacrifice of most of their own forces. You plan to lose 70% of your people? He asked. We plan to win regardless of losses, Lisa Grant corrected. The casualty rate was just part of the operational calculation. Medical teams began moving through the ship, treating wounded personnel with the same efficient casualness they applied to equipment maintenance. Severely injured crew members were stabilized and prepared for transport while those with minor wounds returned to duty immediately. Johnson, you've got a broken arm, Medic Nancy Price told one Marine. Can I still shoot? Johnson asked. Probably. But you should rest. I'll rest when we're done cleaning up, Johnson replied, returning to his station with his arm in a makeshift sling. Kethver watched similar exchanges throughout the ship. Humans with injuries that would hospitalize most species continued working as if nothing had happened. They treated pain and disability as minor inconveniences rather than serious medical conditions. Bridge. This is engineering, came Chief Pete Collins' voice over the communication system. I've got the main power back online, but we're running on fumes. I need at least 6 hours to repair the backup systems. How long until we can jump to hyperspace? Morrison asked. 20 minutes, but I wouldn't recommend it. Half our navigation systems are held together with spare parts and optimism. Do it anyway, Morrison ordered. We need to get our wounded to a proper medical facility. Kethver listened to this exchange with growing amazement. The humans were preparing to make a hyperspace jump with severely damaged systems rather than wait for proper repairs. Any other species would establish a safe perimeter and conduct thorough maintenance before attempting interstellar travel. Is hyperspace travel safe with damaged navigation systems? He asked. Probably not, Captain Morrison admitted. But staying here isn't safe either. The hegemony might send reinforcements. All their ships in this system have been destroyed. All their ships in this system have been destroyed. Colonel Harrison agreed. But they have ships in other systems. We need to assume they'll want revenge. As the Liberty's Edge prepared for departure, Kethver realized that the humans were already planning their next military operation. They had just achieved an impossible victory against overwhelming odds, but they were treating it as a single step in a longer campaign. What happens next? He asked. Next, we hunt down the rest of the hegemony fleet, Lisa Grant replied matter-of-factly. This was just their raiding force. Their main battle fleet is still out there somewhere. You're planning to attack their main fleet? Kethver asked in disbelief. We're planning to eliminate them as a threat, Captain Morrison said. Today we proved that hegemony tactics don't work against human opponents. Now we need to make sure they never get a chance to adapt. The ship jumped to hyperspace with a mechanical shudder that suggested the navigation systems were indeed functioning on optimism as much as engineering. As the stars shifted outside the observation windows, Kethver began working on his preliminary report. How could he explain what he had witnessed? The humans had not just won an impossible victory, they had done it while planning for their own destruction. They fought with a combination of tactical creativity and personal sacrifice that operated outside every military principle. He understood more disturbing was their casual attitude toward catastrophic losses. They discussed the deaths of their comrades with the same emotional detachment other species reserved for equipment failures. As he began documenting his observations, Kethver realized that his report would challenge fundamental assumptions about warfare and civilization throughout the galaxy. 3 weeks after returning to Zentara Prime, Kethver still had not finished his report. He sat in his private office staring at a blank document while his hands trembled slightly. Every time he tried to write about what he had witnessed, the words seemed inadequate. The preliminary briefing had not gone well, Ambassador. Your initial statements seem highly exaggerated, Councilmember Vextara had said during the emergency session. You claim that humans achieved a 12-to-1 victory ratio against a superior enemy force. I claim that humans eliminated an entire hegemony battle fleet while sustaining 70% casualties, Kethver had replied. The mathematics are accurate, even if the implications are disturbing. 70% casualties would indicate a catastrophic defeat, not a victory. Councilmember Zatok had observed. For any other species, yes, Kethver had agreed. Humans calculate victory differently. The council members had exchanged skeptical looks. Military victories with such high casualty rates were theoretically impossible. Either Kethver was misunderstanding something fundamental, or humans possessed capabilities that challenged basic assumptions about warfare now. As he struggled to complete his formal report, Kethver realized that the problem was not the mathematics, but the psychology. How could he explain that humans treated their own deaths as acceptable tactical costs? His communication device chimed with an incoming message from the Council archives. Similar reports were arriving from other observer missions. Every diplomat who had witnessed recent human military operations was filing documents that seemed to contradict established military theory. Ambassador Kalinara had observed humans fighting the Korthik Syndicate near the Rigel system. Her report described tactics that involved deliberate ship collisions and the use of severely wounded personnel as active combatants. Final outcome: complete human victory with 85% casualties. Ambassador Turvash had witnessed human colonial forces defending against Saurian raiders. His report documented the use of civilian volunteers in frontline combat roles and strategic decisions that prioritized enemy elimination over force preservation. Final outcome: total elimination of raiding force with 63% human Casualties Commander Yultum had observed human deep space operations against pirate fleets. Her report described boarding actions where human Marines continued fighting while critically injured and tactical approaches that seemed designed to maximize close-range combat. Final outcome: destruction of 3 pirate fleets with 91% human casualties. Skither read through the reports with growing unease. Every observer had witnessed the same pattern: humans achieving impossible victories through tactics that other species would consider suicidal. More disturbing was the consistency of human casualty rates. They seemed to calculate acceptable losses at levels that would destroy any other military force. His door chimed with a visitor request. Kethver looked up to see Dr. Meltara, the Council's chief psychological analyst, waiting in the corridor. "Ambassador, I was hoping we could discuss your observations," she said as she entered his office. "Your report has raised some concerns among the medical staff." "What kind of concerns?" Kethver asked. "Specifically, your claims about human pain tolerance and injury response," Dr. Meltara replied, settling into a chair across from his desk. "You describe personnel continuing to fight with injuries that should cause immediate incapacitation." "I documented what I observed," Kethver said defensively. "Human Marines continued combat operations despite wounds that would hospitalize most species for weeks. That's neurologically impossible," Dr. Meltara stated. "Pain responses are evolutionary adaptations that prevent further injury. Any species that could ignore severe trauma would have bred itself into extinction through reckless behavior." Kethver activated his personal recording device and played back footage from the boarding action. Dr. Meltara watched as Private Kate Rogers continued fighting with injuries that were clearly life-threatening. "How do you explain this?" Kethver asked Dr. Meltara studied the recording for several minutes before responding. "I can't," she admitted. "This behavior violates fundamental principles of biological self-preservation. Then perhaps our fundamental principles are incomplete." Kethver suggested. Over the following days, more reports arrived from across the galaxy. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Wherever humans encountered military opposition, the same tactical approaches appeared: extreme aggression, acceptance of massive casualties, and strategic thinking that prioritized enemy elimination. Over self-preservation, the Council convened an emergency session to address what was being called the human problem. Representatives from dozens of species gathered to discuss reports that challenged basic assumptions about civilized warfare. "The data suggests that humans pose a significant threat to galactic stability," announced Supreme Council member Dexara. "Their military capabilities appear to exceed initial estimates by several orders of magnitude. More concerning is their apparent willingness to sustain unlimited casualties," added military advisor Kurbith. "Traditional deterrence strategies rely on the assumption that enemies will retreat when losses become unacceptable. Humans seem to have no such threshold." Kethver listened to the discussion with growing dread. The Council was beginning to view humanity as a threat rather than a potential ally. The very qualities that made humans effective warriors were causing other species to fear them. "What do you recommend, Ambassador?" Supreme Council member Dexara asked. Kethver stood slowly, his 3 hearts beating irregularly as he considered his response. His report would determine how the galaxy responded to humanity for generations to come. "I recommend immediate acceptance of humans into the Galactic Defense Coalition," he said finally. "With full military cooperation privileges and strategic consultation authority." The council chamber erupted in surprised voices. Several representatives demanded explanations, while others questioned Kethver's judgment. "You recommend military alliance with a species you describe as psychologically unstable?" Supreme Council member Dexara asked. "I recommend alliance with a species that has demonstrated they can defeat any enemy through sheer determination," Kethver replied. "The question is not whether humans are dangerous. They clearly are. The question is whether we want them as allies or enemies." "Explain." Military advisor Kurbith demanded. "Humans don't fight to win battles," Kethver said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "They fight to ensure their enemies can never threaten them again." They will pursue defeated foes across the galaxy and eliminate them completely rather than risk future conflicts. That suggests aggressive expansionism. Observe Council Member Vextara. That suggests thorough problem-solving, Kethver corrected. Humans learned warfare fighting each other for millions of years. They developed tactics designed to defeat the most creative, ruthless, and determined opponents imaginable themselves. He activated his personal display and showed tactical recordings from the Tau Ceti battle. The council members watched as human ships performed maneuvers that violated basic survival instincts. Any species that provokes humans into full-scale warfare will face an enemy that considers total victory worth any sacrifice. Kethver continued, "They don't retreat, they don't surrender, and they don't negotiate from weakness. They fight until either they win completely or they all die trying." The chamber fell silent as the implications became clear. Humanity represented something unprecedented. In galactic history, a species that had weaponized its own self-destructive tendencies. Your recommendation? Supreme Council Member Dexara asked quietly. "Never give humans a reason to consider us enemies," Kethver replied. "Because if we do, our superior technology and numbers won't matter. They'll find a way to win, and they'll pay any price to ensure we never threaten them again." 6 months later, humanity was formally inducted into the Galactic Defense Coalition. With unprecedented authority over military strategy and tactical planning. The official records listed their membership as recognition of their strategic capabilities. The classified addendum, available only to council members, contained Kethver's complete report and a single recommendation. Under no circumstances should any galactic species engage humans in military conflict unless prepared for a war of total extermination. Keth retired from diplomatic service shortly afterward and entered psychological treatment for what military doctors diagnosed as severe observational trauma. In his final personal log, he wrote a single entry that was never made public. "I was told to watch humans fight. I regret ever going. But I regret even more that I understand now why they always win."